we will be here with Mr. David Quammen. Thank you.
Buongiorno, sono Linda
Good
e
morning.
faccio
My
parte
name
di
is Linda and
WeScience,
I'm a
il gruppo
member of
giovani di
WeScience,
BergamoScienza.
the youth
Prima di
group for
iniziare vi chiedo un
BergamoScienza.
momento di
Before starting,
attenzione e vi
please pay
ricordo che
attention and be
collegandosi sul
reminded
sito di
that connecting to
bergamoscienza.it e cliccando
bergamoscienza.it
sul
and
pulsante
clicking
Guardate la
on
diretta è
look
possibile
at the
seguire l'evento in
live
streaming
version, you can
dal canale
follow the
YouTube di
event
Bergamoscienza e sulla pagina
streaming from
Facebook
the
sempre di
YouTube
Bergamoscienza. Da entrambi i
channel
canali
and
potete
Facebook.
inviare
For both
domande ai
channels, you can
relatori
send
e
questions
invitare i
to our
vostri amici a
speakers and you invite
partecipare
your
alla
friends
conferenza.
to
Le
participate
domande
in the
dal web
conference. Questions
verranno
from the
raccolte
web
dai
will be
volontari e
collected
verranno
by the
proposte,
volunteers and asked
e ne verranno proposte
during
una
the
selezione
question and
durante il
answer
dibattito in
session.
sala. Le conferenze della 23esima
The
edizione di
23rd
BergamoScienza
edition of
sono rese
BergamoScienza
accessibili alle
conferences are
persone
made
con disabilità
accessible to
motorie e
disabled
sensoriali,
people,
garantendo luoghi privi di barriere
granting places
architettoniche
where there
e
are no
servizi di
architectural
traduzione in
barriers
LIS.
and also
Tutte le
translation
conferenze
in
sono
sign
video
language.
registrate,
All the
alcune delle quali
conferences
trasmesse
are
anche in diretta
being
streaming, e le
recorded,
conferenze con
and
ospiti
the
stranieri prevedono la
conferences
traduzione
with
simultanea.
foreign
Le
guests will be
registrazioni
translated
verranno pubblicate sui
simultaneously.
nostri canali
Recordings
ufficiali
will be
al termine del
published on
festival.
our official
Questi
channels
servizi
at the
sono
end of the
resi
festival.
disponibili
These
grazie
services are
alla
made
fondazione
available thanks
della
to the
comunità bergamasca e a Fondazione Banca Popolare
Foundation
di
Banca
Bergamo, che
Popolare di
insieme a
Bergamo,
BergamoScienza
together with
sono impegnate a
BergamoScienza,
promuovere
have
l'inclusione e
committed
l'accessibilità.
themselves to promote
Per la
inclusion
traduzione
and
simultanea è
accessibility. For
sufficiente
simultaneous translation,
scaricare il
please
QR code che
scan
vi
the
possono
QR
fornire i
code
volontari in sala e
and
trovare o lo
find,
trovate
or
proiettato alle mie
you can
spalle.
also find it
Il QR
projected
code indicherà
behind me. The QR
direttamente
code will direct you to the
Converso Web App,
Converso
dove
web
potete
app,
selezionare
where
la
you can
lingua
select the
dal
language
menu a
you're
tendina.
interested in from
Per l'ascolto della
the
traduzione è
drop-down
necessaria una
menu.
coppia
To
di
listen to
auricolari
the translation, you need
che per
earphones.
cortesia vi chiediamo, per cortesia vi chiediamo di utilizzare i vostri.
Kindly use
Chi ne
your
fosse
own.
momentaneamente
Those who haven't
sprovvisto
got a
può chiedere ai
pair
nostri
can ask
volontari.
our
Vi do il
volunteers in the
benvenuto
room. I would
all'evento di
like to
questa
welcome
mattina
you all
intitolato
today
Animali, Umani
at
e Virus.
Animals,
Avremo il piacere di
Humans and
ospitare
Viruses.
come
We are
relatori
pleased
David Quammen
to host
di
David
National
Quammen
Geographic e
from
Telmo Pievani di
National
Fondazione
Geographic
BergamoScienza.
and Telmo
Vi
Pievani
preghiamo
from
di silenziare i vostri
BergamoScienza
apparecchi
Foundation.
elettronici
Please
e di
mute your
partecipare
phones and
numerosi
take
alle
part
altre
in our
iniziative di
events.
BergamoScienza. Grazie per l'attenzione e buon
Thank you
ascolto.
for listening and enjoy the conference.
Grazie, grazie, ben ritrovati.
Thank you and welcome back. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Here we are with David Quammen. It's a great honor, great privilege we are given. David defines our conversations, the Telmo and David show, but it is going to be a David show today. We tour the world, actually. We have great fun together. David needs no introduction. National Geographic. He wrote beautiful articles for National Geographic, and recently they were put together in a collection, The Heartbeat of the Wild. He is also the writer of Spillover. He became very famous because it was published in 2012, much earlier than the pandemic struck, and at the time he described it in detail. And also Breathless is a sequel to Spillover. He described what happened between 2020 and 2021, the anxiety that we felt at the time, all the researchers committed. And books he writes after working, boots on the ground, going where research is being carried out, places where there are spillovers of pathogens, and interviewing hundreds of scientists, of researchers, one-on-one interviews. This is how scientific journalism should be carried out. But David, I would start from another work that was recently republished in Italy, and this was done when the celebration of the 200 years from Darwin's birth. It's a book on Darwin, the reluctant Mr. Darwin. I would be starting here, also then switching to pandemics, because you described a very special Darwin. Your Darwin is a reluctant Mr. Darwin. That's how you called him, the reluctant Mr. Darwin. And this is the odd, weird story of Darwin before he became famous as Darwin, the great, renowned naturalist. Why did you decide to devote one full book to Charles Darwin? From this perspective, he was very frightened. It took him a long time before he published his works. Welcome back to BergamoScienza, among other things. Thank you.
Thank you, Telmo, and thank you all. I love being in Bergamo. It's great to be back in Bergamo. BergamoScienza is an event that I have been privileged to be part of in the past, and I'm very glad to be with you all again here. And glad to be with my friend Telmo. As he mentioned, we think of these as the Telmo and David show. And my new book, newly republished book on Charles Darwin, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, is also in a sense the Telmo and David show because there is a new introduction by Telmo, putting it into perspective for the present day. And Darwin is not just a historical figure, he is a scientist for our time. He is a hero of what science can be, courageous, honest, independent. So I'm glad that the book is republished by Cortina now because it's, I think, very timely. But you ask why I took this particular perspective, Telmo, and why it's entitled The Reluctant Mr. Darwin. The reason I used the term reluctant for Darwin during the middle years of his life was that 21 years passed between the moment in 1838 when he was 29 years old and he had the idea of evolution by natural selection. 21 years until 1859 when he was 50 years old when he finally published his great book on the origin of species. And some of that 21-year period was spent simply on hard work, gathering more data, refining his arguments, making sure that the book that he published was an absolutely persuasive, authoritative book. But he had reasons to drag his feet a little bit and delay. And those reasons had to do with the trouble that he knew he was going to cause. He was a fundamentally conservative man who found himself burdened with a radical idea, a dangerous idea. And he knew when he published that, it would cause offense to the religious establishment in England. It would cause reaction, provocation to the scientific establishment in England. And those two, the scientific and religious establishment, were really one establishment because some of the most important scientists were also Anglican clergymen. He knew it would cause discomfort to his wife, who was a very pious Christian. He knew it would cause some political resistance, political suspicion, because evolution itself was thought of as a radical French idea in England of the 1830s, the 1840s, and the 1850s, because of an earlier scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, in the very early years of the 19th century, had published a general theory of evolution, talked about evolution having occurred, but he didn't have a persuasive mechanism. He couldn't explain how it occurred. But he was French, and the French Revolution had recently happened, and conservative English political forces were very suspicious of anything that was a radical French idea, which evolution was. So for these and other reasons, he was reluctant to publish his book, and yet he was so courageous and so inherently honest and stubborn that he went ahead, finally did publish it in 1859 and gave us The Origin of Species.
Tra l'altro questa è una storia
Amongst other things, this is a very special story. So 20 years to publish a book, it's a lot of time. The 20 years from when he was 29 to when he was 50. He published The Origin of the Species at 50, when his scientific career has been spent in the scientific establishment. And he did this in silence. Nobody knew that he had in his drawers all these radical, dangerous revolutionary ideas. So a lot of time, 20 years, so much so that during these 20 years, ci scusiamo, ma c'è stato. Apologies, we cannot hear. Okay, thank you. Apologies, couldn't hear. So they started discussing these mysterious ideas, and Darwin said, I will never publish these ideas because it would be like confessing a murder. So you see what was the emotional, psychological burden that he had in being hesitant in publishing the book. Then he took shortcuts because for 80 years, and David describes this very well because he's a great master in writing, so invented a sort of metaphor. Darwin was like the egg of the kiwi. You know, this is a bird from New Zealand. He has a giant egg, and this is due to evolutionary aspects. So the females have to hatch a huge egg, and Darwin, it is as if had this big egg inside him for 20 years. David, you know all this, so apologies, the translation is not working. Actually, we're translating.
Actually, I lost the translation feed, so...
Don't worry, you know very well what I'm saying. Si dedica per 8 anni.
And therefore, he devoted himself to very special animals, the barnacles. These are crustaceans that are attached to rocks. So this was very strange because a man who had devoted himself to geology just worked on this specific species of animals, barnacles. There is a colleague who said, why barnacles? Why just barnacles? And he answered, because after arranging across different theories, I wanted to know about a very small animal in nature. This is typical for Darwin, so a great theoretician and also great observer. And during these 80 years at the time, already in primary schools, children were asked, what is the job your father is doing? And Darwin's child wrote, my father studies barnacles. He was convinced that his father was like everybody else, all studying barnacles. But David, can you follow? Is the translation working? What is the end to this story after him studying so many years barnacles? He kept being silent, but then he started exchanging letters with Alfred Wallace, a much younger naturalist, and he discovers that this young naturalist had come to his same conclusions in parallel, traveling across Malaysia and Indonesia. How is it that Darwin decided to publish his works? This is something very interesting. Why don't you tell us this story?
Right. So after this 21, actually it was after 20 years of work, as Telmo said, in secret on his idea, the proof that evolution occurs and the mechanism by which it occurs. 20 years he worked on this, the idea that he called natural selection. The idea that species evolve because there are always more offspring born than there is food and space for them, so that most individuals of any animal species or humans that are born fail to survive. They die. The fittest survive. There's natural selection of those that are best adapted, and that's how species originate and change. This was his idea. In June of 1858, after 20 years, Darwin got a letter in the mail from a young man who was out in the Malay archipelago, which is what we now call Indonesia, a young naturalist. Nobody had ever heard of this man. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace. He was penniless. He didn't have the scientific connections that Darwin had, but he had wonderful powers of observation and thought, and by looking at the populations of butterflies and of birds and of mammals on the different islands of the Malay archipelago, he had an idea. And his idea was that species evolve from one shape to another by a process of differential survival based on which individuals are best adapted. Darwin's idea. Alfred Russel Wallace wrote this in a paper. He drafted a 20-page paper, and he sent it to one person who he thought might be willing to help him. A famous naturalist, a famous biologist in England who was not known for anything about evolution. He sent it to Charles Darwin. Darwin receives this letter, and he says, "Oh my God, I've waited too long, I've been too reluctant, I've delayed, and now this young man has essentially preempted me. He has created the same theory that I have been nurturing for 20 years, and now he wants me to help him publish it, and I am duty-bound, honor-bound to help him publish this, and therefore lose all credit for my great theory and my 20 years of work." And then Darwin's scientific friends, he had some powerful scientific friends, and they said, no, relax, Charles. You haven't lost everything. We will arrange joint presentation of these two ideas by Alfred Russel Wallace and by you, joint publication of his paper and excerpts from your ongoing work, because we know that he had shared it with just these few friends. We know you've been working on this for 20 years. So that happened in the summer of 1858 at a meeting of a scientific society on a hot night in London with only about 20 people present, much tinier than this crowd. And then no one really noticed. No one paid attention to these two presentations. But Darwin sat down and in a rush, in 1 year, wrote what he called an abstract of his great idea, the huge book that he was working on. He wrote a short version. We'd call it the quick and dirty version, in 1 year, and that was published in November of 1859, and that was the book that was titled On the Origin of Species. That was the book that persuaded everyone, and that's the reason we talk about Darwin's theory of evolution rather than the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution.
Esatto, quindi la teoria dell'evoluzione usando...
That's right. So the theory of evolution should be called Darwin-Wallace theory, because this was the initial announcement. But anyway, I ask you, David, now, what's nice about Darwin is also to try and understand how we updated what he thought, how, what he thought was integrated. Tell us about the current status of the theory of evolution. You've written a great book titled The Tangled Tree. And it goes back to Darwin's image, the tree of life, the idea that Darwin understands already in his secret books, that all forms of life on the earth are close, without any exception. We're all part of a huge tree of life, and Homo sapiens is just one branch in millions of other branches. But you tell of recent research that Darwin couldn't even envisage, where we discovered that the tree is tangled. There are also horizontal connections. Evolution does not move by divergence, but sometimes by mixing species or uniting different species through bridges. Why is it that this research was so interesting to you? And then we'll also see that this also has implications on diseases and pandemics today.
Right. Well, exactly, Telmo. There have been some amazing discoveries, amazing developments in biology since Darwin, particularly amazing discoveries just in the last 30 or 40 years. Darwin's theory is still correct. It is still strong. It is still the single overarching, most important idea in biology. But it's been added to. There are complications. There are refinements. There are additions to Darwin's theory, things that Darwin himself never foresaw. And the adding to Darwin's theory began back it began at the time he was writing. There was a Moravian monk in the Austro-Hungarian Empire named Gregor Mendel, who was doing experiments on pea plants, who worked out a theory of heredity. Darwin did not have a theory of heredity. How is it that traits are passed along from a mother and a father of any species to create different results in the offspring? Why is it that some people were born with blue eyes and some people were born with brown eyes? And what is it that determines the color of hair? Complications that Darwin didn't foresee, but that Mendel understood by understanding that heredity was determined by one unit from the mother, one unit from the father, and those two units interact in a certain way where one may dominate the other, and you have patterns of heredity. That was Mendel. Then we had, in the 20th century, among other things, we had refinements in understanding genetics. We had the discovery that the DNA molecule is the information molecule that carries inheritance. We had other discoveries from molecular biology in the study of the gene. Eventually, we had the discovery that Telmo referred to and that I describe in my book, The Tangled Tree, L'Arbore Intricato, that hereditary material, DNA, not only passes vertically from parents to offspring, but can pass also horizontally across species boundaries. Genes can be carried sideways from one kind of creature into another, from one species of bacterium into another, from one animal into another, transported by mechanisms that Darwin never imagined, such as being carried by a virus. A virus can capture a gene in one species of animal and then carry that gene, and by infecting another species of animal, can deposit that gene in a different species. And this is what makes the tree tangled. Epigenetics, the understanding that DNA is modified by other molecules on the outside of the DNA molecule that control the expression of genes. And even that some of those modifications of DNA that carry expression of genes that are acquired during the life of one individual can, in some cases, be passed on to offspring. The inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is what Lamarck had been talking about back in 1808. So there's a recognition that there was some correctness, some validity to that too. All of these things have been added to Darwin's theory to make it richer, more fully persuasive, more modern, without ever falsifying it.
Questo è un ottimo esempio, no, di come
This is a great example of how a research program such as the Darwinian one is updated and integrated. For instance, today we know horizontal gene transfer. This is a festival dedicated to the information. This year, BergamoScienza tells us that information in evolution is not just transmitted through the branches by divergence, but also horizontally. Or there is also hybridation amongst different branches and or twigs. And it happened, we talked about this between Neanderthal and Sapiens, and then later on, a genetic bridge amongst human species that lived recently. We were saying this has implication also today. For example, after having written Spillover and Breathless, now you have written a lot on another important threat we also discussed here at BergamoScienza, which is the other side of microbia, not viruses, but rather bacteria that develop resistance to all antibiotics. And how can they do that? Well, often they do that right because bacteria exchange material, genetic information very quickly and horizontally, developing new resistance. Why is it that we should worry about this? And what are you studying? Did you interview scientists about this? What is happening? Why should we be worried about this antibiotic resistance?
Well, the problem of antibiotic resistance is starting to be recognized as a very, very serious problem for human health. As Telmo said, bacteria achieve resistance to antibiotics by a process of Darwinian natural selection. But there's also another factor. Darwinian natural selection, even in bacteria, would move relatively slowly if each species of bacteria had to acquire, by mutation, changes, incremental changes in its genome, had to gradually acquire resistance to one form of antibiotic and then gradually acquire resistance to another form of antibiotic. And there are bacteria like this that have multiple resistance. MRSA, M-R-S-A, is the abbreviation for multiple resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a dangerous kind of bacteria. But to acquire multiple resistance to different antibiotics is a relatively slow process if you do it simply by mutation and natural selection. It moves quickly. It moves dangerously quickly throughout the planet from one kind of bacteria to another, from one species of bacteria into another, by horizontal gene transfer, what I wrote about in The Tangled Tree and what Telmo was just mentioning. So in an instant, bacteria A can pass the genes for resistance to 5 different antibiotics to bacteria species B by horizontal transfer of genes, literally a tube going out from one bacteria into another, almost as though these different species of bacterium are mating. But they're not mating. What they're doing is passing genes horizontally from one to another, so that antibiotic resistance is, along with emerging viruses, is the next very, very serious infectious disease threat that we'll be talking about on this planet.
Esatto, quindi ricordiamoci.
That's right. Let's not forget, therefore, that this threat doesn't just come from viruses, but also from this very rapid evolution of bacteria. So at this point, it's the Red Queen mechanism who has to run, as Lewis Carroll says, with an environment that moves faster and faster. Bacteria are fast, and we're not as fast as bacteria in developing antibiotics, so we have to find new ways. Today, for instance, we use AI to find new molecules or reuse already existing molecules that could be quickly used and be effective against these resistant bacteria. But I come to another point which is interesting to all of us. Let's move to the other side, viruses, which are samples of Darwinian evolution because they change very rapidly, they mutate very rapidly, they develop resistance, they diversify very rapidly, they conquer new hosts, and this is another big problem. Moreover, you can tell us something about this. You've always stressed one aspect which in the public debate should be explained better, i.e. pandemics today, besides being favored by these viral mechanisms, these natural Darwinian mechanisms, are also favored by us, because we unfortunately create perfect environments for viruses. We're 8 billion people, we move around, we live in cities, we fly on intercontinental flights, we devastate the environment in which we have animals carrying these viruses. So we are strongly increasing the pandemic's probability. In 2020, we were struck by the pandemic, and you say this probability has not decreased in time. You've probably seen a work on Nature, incredible, where wet markets, those places you remember where animals are alive or dead and are all mixed together, these are perfect incubators for these pandemics, have not decreased after the pandemic. They're more than in the past. And in fact, they're even more secret, so there is illegal trade of exotic animals. So we're getting worse rather than better. This is pure folly. Does it work? Doesn't it work?
I have to shift to English. not as
1, 2, 3, testing, testing. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? 1, 2, 3, testing. 1, 2, 3, testing, testing, testing. Can you hear me now?
Aspetta, vediamo.
So shall I say something about pandemics?
Yeah, I was saying that viruses are champions of Darwinian evolution, but it's not enough because we are creating anthropic niches that promote more diffusion of viruses. So we have a problem of ecology for the pandemic.
Yes.
Anyway, my question was related to what is happening in the United States, because, you know, we have to be very worried about one line of virus, the H5N1.
Yes, let's talk about
and
that.
the problem is that in the last months, we know quite nothing about what is happening in the United States because we don't have data. And so we have a great problem now in monitoring what is happening for a possible future pandemic in the United States.
Right, right. We have pandemic threats that are facing us. There are more viruses out there, and we are interacting with the animals that carry those viruses all the time. We're doing that by disturbing natural forests, by killing wild animals for food, by transporting wild animals. We're doing it by industrial-scale animal husbandry of domestic animals, giant operations of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pigs, or millions and millions of chickens. And those are petri dishes. Those are breeding grounds for the evolution of viruses that potentially could pass from their animal host into humans. The most concerning to the scientists that I talk to right now is the influenza virus known as H5N1, or generally the H5 strain of viruses that are bird viruses, bird influenzas, that are very lethal to birds and very transmissible among birds, and that are capable also of getting into animals. H5N1 began in wild birds, got into humans and was recognized, got into domestic birds and was recognized back in 1997, the early years of this century. And now it has transmitted through wild birds all over the planet, millions and millions of wild birds carrying this virus, and it is getting into domestic poultry operations. We have 33 billion chickens on this planet at a given moment, and all of those chickens also are potential reservoirs in which this virus can continue to evolve, continue to change toward the possibility of becoming a human virus. In the meantime, we have an administration running my country that is determined to shut down most of our defenses against pandemic threats. The National Institutes of Health is being gutted. It's losing its ability to give grants to scientists for research, not just scientists in the US, but scientists around the world. The Centers for Disease Control is being scrambled and put in disarray because of political appointments and political mandates, and because of the disbelief in the value of vaccines. We have these people running the country that are ignorant of the way science works and that disbelieve in the value of vaccines. We have shut down the Pandemic Preparedness Office in the White House. We're doing things to make ourselves less prepared for a pandemic that might start next week than we were in January of 2020 for the COVID pandemic. It's a very dangerous situation, to put it lightly, and it is made worse by the fact that politics are constraining science. I have a scientist friend who says that when you mix politics and science, you get politics. Mm-hmm. You don't get science. And that's what's happening now. And we just have to hope that that this time passes and that we can get better leadership and revivify our scientific institutions before the consequences hit us in the form of another pandemic, an avian influenza pandemic, or another coronavirus pandemic.
Let's try to we have a technical? Please, come.
Try this again? Okay.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you. Here I am. Can you hear me well? Fine. Thank you very much. Hello. Hello, David.
Everybody, let's say thanks to Lydia, the translator. She's back. Thank you, Lydia.
Give me a confirmation. Puoi sentire la mia...
Can you hear my translation, the translation of what I'm saying? Okay, fine. Perfect. So obviously now for what you're saying is very serious indeed, because sharing of information, speaking about information and data is basic for science. Any scientific theory, when a country is no longer sharing data, not telling us what's going on, is very serious, because viruses are uninterested to national borders. They take a flight and they arrive in Europe. This is something that European governments should be prompting more bravely, because this is to the detriment of everybody if the NHA is not funded. In a recent interview, you stated that Darwin is #1 public enemy today in the United States. Why so? Because they haven't realized yet there is no debate on Darwinian. Why is Darwin public enemy #1 in the United States?
You know, there's no test for scientific literacy in the application to run for president of the United States. Doesn't happen. Democracy, in its wisdom, sometimes gives us leaders that the majority of the people have voted for, but do not serve the interests of the majority of the people, do not serve the interests of anyone but a small number of people. And every country has experienced this. Italy has experienced this. My country has experienced it, experiencing it very badly now. We have to hope that, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of government in the world, except for all the other systems. And so this is what we have, and we want to keep it. We want to keep democracy, but we have to hope that, that people who vote, the more the better, will vote with some awareness that science is a very, very important process for the acquisition of more and more clear, correct understanding of the natural world. And also that people will understand that science is a self-correcting process. Scientists correct one another as data is gathered, as new facts appear. Hypotheses are either confirmed or they're refuted or they're improved for the new data. And that science is also a consensual process. You know this, Telmo, you're a scientist. Science is no longer just what one person says, what one man or what one woman says. It's a matter of the gathering of voices that have all looked at the evidence, have all compared the hypotheses to the data, and have reached a consensus that yes, this we can safely say is an accurate understanding of such and such, of vaccines, or of viral evolution, or of horizontal gene transfer. You can always find one person who has a PhD in science who will say any crazy thing. And if you find that person, then you can stand that person up and say, well, look, our scientist, Horace Flugelnose, says that climate change is a hoax. So the question is undecided. Although over on this side are 10,000 scientists with PhDs who've been working on climate change for 30 years, and they agree that climate change is very real and very severe. Now, if you don't understand that this is not an unsettled question, then you don't understand science, and alas, our political leaders currently do not.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Questa l'abbiamo registrata, la
We've recorded this, we'll translate it, and it'll become BergamoScienza's sentence for the future editions. It's going to be our guide. Okay, I'll still ask you a couple of questions, David, and then get ready, because David is available to answer your questions, especially coming from students, from young people present in this room, because this is a meeting that's part of something that's dedicated to students in particular. So the floor will come to you. But I'll ask you one last thing, because Darwin, I go back to Darwin, another not known aspect is that Darwin was also the founder of ecology. The idea of the entangled bank with all these relationships amongst microorganisms, plants and animals then inspired Ernst Haeckel, his German pupil, to develop the term ecology. So from this point of view, Darwin was of fundamental importance to read the status of biodiversity today. I ask you, you've been traveling around the world with National Geographic. What is happening to biodiversity? We're talking about the sixth extinction, and what are the processes which instead are working? Because in a very beautiful book, The Wild Heartbeat of Nature, of wildlife, we have this project of the parks of peace in Africa. And this is a beautiful idea, creating parks that protect biodiversity, but built so as to favor local populations, with the money coming from tourism, from ecotourism, not the one we are doing today in luxury resorts in Africa or in African safaris, a real ecotourism. Well, the money coming from that would be given to local populations. And this has already happened in Mozambique and in other countries. Places where there was guerrilla in the past, where there was suffering, have become peaceful places in the name of defending biodiversity. And this is beautiful. I mean, defending the rights of the natives and put together with the beauty and the biodiversity of those places. What do you think about it?
So you're absolutely right, Telmo, that it's important to remember that Charles Darwin pioneered two sciences, two branches of biological science: evolutionary biology and ecology. Evolutionary biology is the origin of biological diversity, and ecology is the study of the structure of relationships, the dynamics of relationships between one form of creature and another, between creatures and their ecosystems, creatures and their physical environments. Ecology comes from the word house, and it's the study of the houses in which living creatures reside. For 45 years, that's been my particular literary beat, literary niche, writing about ecology and evolutionary biology, traveling the world for National Geographic and some other magazines, traveling the world to research my books, and looking at biological diversity in different places, in Madagascar, in New Guinea, in the Congo, in the Amazon, in Tasmania, on the islands of Indonesia, going to all these places where there are strange and wonderful forms of life that have evolved over time by Darwinian mechanisms and exist in intricate interactions with one another. But now, of course, in in recent decades and over recent centuries, we humans have had more and more impact on those wild ecosystems, more and more impact on that biological diversity. There are 8 billion of us on the planet now. We're hungry. We're brilliant. We're restless. We travel around the world. We burn fossil fuels. We make use of resources that come from tropical forests and tropical ecosystems. We have impacts on the world. We cause climate change. We cause the extinction of species by destroying habitat as well as killing animals and cutting down trees. We're causing massive losses of biological diversity. And we need to put that in perspective. People hear about these things and they say, oh, no, it's so complicated, and now we're hearing about climate change more and more. What can we do? What are the causes? And I have a fairly simple, I hope dramatic, metaphor that I use to put these problems in perspective. Some people say, well, climate change is the big problem that contains every other problem, right? No. People tend to think that because we've heard so much about climate change in the last couple of decades. But climate change, as I've said before, is just one of 3 parallel problems, human-caused problems that we have on this planet. And those 3 parallel problems all have the same ultimate cause. The 3 parallel problems run like big, dark, brown, roiling rivers. 3 rivers of trouble, all running off a snowfield on the same mountain. The 3 rivers are climate change, loss of biological diversity, and the emergence of new infectious diseases, particularly viruses. Those are our 3 problems. They're related to one another, but they're not all contained, 2 of them within an ultimate third one. No, they're to a great degree independent, but with the same cause. What's the cause? What's causing these 3 rivers to run off that snowfield on the mountain? Human population size multiplied by human consumption, including human waste. That's what's causing our footprint. That's what's causing us to melt that snowfield and feed these 3 rivers of trouble. So to deal with those 3 problems, we have to understand their ultimate source. Human population size, not just human population size, multiplied by consumption. And of course, we know that some people say, well, there are villages in Africa where a family has 6 or 7 kids. That's too much population growth, too much reproduction. But no, in a poor rural village in Africa, if there's a family with 6 or 7 kids, those 6 or 7 kids will consume less in their lifetimes than 2 children or even 1 child in a middle-class family in the United States or in Italy. So we have to understand it's consumption and it's waste. The worst sin of all is waste. And once we understand that and accept that, then I hope that we can make some progress in dealing with that and stem those 3 problems that we have.
Bene, grazie.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mentre accendiamo le luci e
While we switch on the lights, raise your hands for questions. One very last question, David. I don't know whether you can answer. You're writing a new book, right? On a beautiful topic, i.e. cancer as a Darwinian evolutionary process. Cancer as an evolutionary process. When will it be published? How is it doing? Give us some news about it, about the new book. If you can.
Thank you for asking. Yeah. And to say, I mean, it is a beautiful subject in the sense that Darwin's theory explains the dynamics of cancer so well. It adds a beautiful element of insight and of hope to our understanding of cancer. This is a school of thought that includes a relatively small number of very brilliant scientists who have been working on this for 20 years, and I've been aware of it for almost that long. Cancer as an evolutionary phenomenon. the idea that tumors evolve, just the way a population of animals evolve. A tumor is a population of cells, and those cells are making copies of themselves. They're competing with one another to make copies of themselves. They're competing for resources, they're competing for blood, they're competing for nutrients, they're competing for space in a tumor. And when you hit a tumor with chemotherapy, for instance, it's like hitting a population of bacteria with an antibiotic. Most of the individuals die, and the ones that survive are the most fit, the ones that happen to be resistant. And for that reason, it's very, very difficult to cure advanced cancer, to kill the very last cells. So these are among the implications of this. I've been working on this book for 3 years. I've been thinking about it for 18 years, since I wrote a magazine story on this back in 2007. The book is now finished in draft. My editor has worked on it, and it's waiting for me back in Montana to make the final corrections before it goes into the process of being copy edited and checked against all of my sources. I will send excerpts to all of my scientific sources to let them look at it and tell me what is incorrect, what needs fixing, and then the book will be published sometime next year.
Grazie. Prego, domande dal pubblico?
Thank you very much. Questions from the audience? Where are the mics? I see one here in the third row on the left-hand side. Here too. Hello, good morning, David, and thank you very much for your presence here in Italy. I wanted to ask you a question concerning climate change. In the last few years, we heard about bacteria and viruses that have somehow woken up from ice, have been discovered in the ice pack. Could this be another problem for the human species besides the spillover we have talked about in the past already?
It's interesting news that there are viruses that have been frozen, for instance, in the bodies of humans that those viruses have killed, and that now as temperatures increase, climate change melts ice, that those viruses will be released. However, I think that it's a relatively tiny threat compared to all of the hundreds of thousands, millions of viruses that are not frozen, but that are living in wild animals in our diverse ecosystems. So the problem of frozen viruses waking up is infinitesimal compared to the problem of viruses that are alive and functioning in bats, in rodents, in monkeys, in other creatures that are functioning in tropical ecosystems and elsewhere, with which humans come in contact and into which those viruses can be spilled.
Prego. Fatevi vedere dai ragazzi che passano, così.
Buongiorno.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you, you talked about how Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was welcomed by the scientific community at that time, also from religious people. And I wanted to ask you, is there any other, even more modern, scientific book that received the same welcoming when published? Do you know of any other book that was so much discussed as Darwin's?
Very good question. I have to think about it.
That's a good question. I would say my first instinct is to say no. Very, very rarely, if at all, has a book that was essentially written for the general public, and that's what The Origin of Species was. It was written not as a technical book, but a book that any person of the time could understand. It's very, very rare for any of those to carry any books to carry the same impact that Darwin's did. But of course, that's partly because our important scientific discoveries now generally are not published in books, they're published in journal papers. So there are certainly journal papers that had impact in ways that approached or matched the impact of Darwin's book on the origin of species. Einstein's two papers, early papers on special relativity and general relativity, which I think was 1905 and 1915. Does that sound right?
Five.
Yeah. Those papers had huge impact. When Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner split the atom in Germany in 1937 or 38, and they announced that to the world, that had huge impact. When Francis Crick and James Watson solved the structure of the DNA molecule and published a little paper in the journal Nature, I think it was only 2 or 3 paragraphs long, in 1953, that had impact that was comparable to the impact of Darwin's book, because the discovery of the DNA, the structure of the DNA molecule, then opened the door for all of our developments in molecular biology. So that's what I would say, is that it seldom happens with a book for the general public. Generally it happens with a scientific paper that is at first understood only by scientists.
A me era venuto in mente forse Silent Spring.
I thought of A Silent Spring, Richard Castle. That was another book addressed to the general audience that generated surprise. He was attacked for his condemnation of DDT, and she's still being attacked today because her charges against DDT caused thousands of deaths for malaria, because we were using DDT to fight malaria insects. So that was a scientist who was very courageous. Yes, someone else from the floor? Good morning. I personally would like to thank you for writing the Song of the Dodo, a really passionate book, the most one, I would say, amongst yours. And to go back to one example of your book, there is a carpet, and there are parts of this carpet. Carpet is nature, and the parts of this carpet is what you describe. So things were not faring that well even then, and this is very clear at the beginning of your book. In your opinion, things were much worse than when the Beagle left for the trip with New Darwin. What do you think about this story of the carpet and its parts, the one you described in the Song of the Dodo?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for the kind words about the Song of the Dodo. Just to bring other people into the understanding on this. The Song of the Dodo was a book that I published in 1996, and it was about evolution and extinction on islands of the world, and what the study of evolution and extinction on islands has taught us about evolution and extinction generally. And the simple answer to that is that the study of islands taught us most of what we know about evolution, at least what we knew until the rise of molecular biology. Most of what we know and understood about evolution, going back to Darwin and the Galapagos Islands, going back to Alfred Russel Wallace and the islands of Indonesia, in a number of other cases, islands exemplified evolution in much more dramatic ways than the mainlands did. You had giant tortoises, you had different species of birds with different shaped beaks living on separate islands not far from one another. You had all sorts of, you had giant flightless birds. You had miniature reptiles that were smaller than the reptiles found on. You had all these different strange patterns. and extinctions. Extinctions happen on islands more frequently than they happen on the mainlands. Why? Because islands contain only small populations of a given species. All populations fluctuate over time, and populations that are small and contained in a space are more likely to fluctuate to zero. So most of the extinctions of birds, reptiles, and mammals that occurred in the last 300 years were forms that were unique to islands. But, and this is why I wrote the book, it was a long book, 600 pages. I traveled all over the world to islands and to other places. It took me 8 years. The reason that it's important for the mainlands is because, as the gentleman mentioned, at the beginning I use an analogy of a carpet, a Persian carpet, a beautiful Persian carpet that's cut up into pieces with a sharp knife, cut up into 36 smaller pieces. And what happens when you cut up a Persian carpet? Do you get 36 beautiful little carpets? No, because they start to unravel, the pieces unravel, and they fall apart. And that happens with habitat for biological diversity too. On the mainlands, as we have destroyed habitat, built roads, established national parks that were surrounded by civilization, we have cut the habitat of the mainlands up into little pieces, like those little pieces of carpet. We have turned the mainlands into places where wildlife and biological diversity only survive in isolated islands, the Abruzzes, or Yellowstone National Park, or the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, surrounded by civilization. And that leads to loss of biological diversity. That leads to a higher risk of extinctions. And it has continued since, 29 years since I published that book, and the trend has only gotten worse. So every time a road is built through the Amazon, or a road is built through the Congo, and that road is then lined through the Congo forest, and that road then is lined with villages and shops and growing presence of humans. One consequence of that is that you have fractured, you have fragmented the habitat. You have started the process of breaking it into pieces. And as that process continues, the inevitable result is loss of more and more biological diversity. So thank you for that question.
Aggiungo.
And allow me to add that I was in Madagascar 1 month last summer, and in Madagascar, deforestation accounts for 90% of the territory. So the primary forests of Madagascar are sort of islands, as you described, scattered here and there. And the question is, to what an extent can we preserve the Madagascar biodiversity? Lemurs, for instance, 90% devastation due to its poverty, because there is a subsistence economy, but also because of colonial devastation of French, English, Koreans that come there, sign agreements with the corrupt leaders of that country. You might have heard that there are riots in Madagascar. They pave road to the resources areas. They bring them away as if it were there. You know, it's a sort of terrible colonialism that you can witness once you go to Madagascar, if you do not go to a luxury resort, of course, and if you visit the country as it is. There is one question over there on the right.
C'era un ragazzo. Ah no, vai. Dopo c'era un ragazzo
Yes,
più avanti.
then there was another young person. Some theories guess that autoimmune diseases we all suffer from are caused by evolutionary process that took place starting from 5,000 years ago. It's because of the increase in population density, because of civilization. Do we run the risk that such a process, given the trend of the last century, is exacerbated, so that this trend of our immune system to be very aggressive against itself increases, or is there a limit beyond which it can no longer be that aggressive and succumb to future diseases.
You know, some people say that the human immune system is one of the most complex systems in the known universe, that it's more complicated than quantum mechanics. I have read about immunology a bit for my book on cancer, but I have never researched the subject in the depth that I would if I were writing a book about immunology. So I'm going to be pretty shy about saying anything about the trends over the last 5,000 years in autoimmune disease. I haven't read those particular papers, and so the best thing I can do is say, it's not an area that I've gone into. It's an area that I'm sure is very complex, interesting, and I'm sure that we have a lot of problems in human health that have been caused by the cultural changes that have gone on over the last 5,000 years in terms of diet, in terms of our population density, in terms of the change in life expectancy, living to much older ages, in terms of the other environmental stresses, not to mention all of the complex chemicals that we have added, artificial chemicals that we have added to the physical environment. So certainly there's a possibility that there have been big implications for autoimmune disease, for challenging the human immune system, but it's not something that I'm qualified to comment on. But I acknowledge the fascination of it. Before we I don't know how close we are to finishing, Telmo, but
maybe a couple of questions last.
Okay, and then there's one note that I want to add, a very important thing, I think, for us all to think about.
Okay.
But go ahead.
Ci sono domande dal web? No?
Are there questions from the web? Thank you to the sign language interpreters because they are wonderful. Thank you very much.
Prego. Quante ce ne sono ancora?
How many questions? Okay, 2 questions.
E un'altra ancora. Va bene, veloci.
3
dai,
questions.
vai.
Very quick, please.
Grazie mille.
Thank you.
Prima abbiamo parlato
Before
di come,
we talk
del rapporto tra scienza e politica.
about the relationship between science and politics, and you mentioned Winston Churchill, and the same thing should be said about science. It is not perfect, but this is the best we get. What can science do in order to try and be more impactful on policy makers so as to become our guide or the guide for politicians, for decisions that they take on our behalf? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that concisely. I think there's one very, very important thing that we have to focus on, and that is better and better scientific education for young children. Science in the schools. And I know that's part of what BergamoScienza is about, which is wonderful. I think children that are 10 years, 11 years, 12 years old, we should be exposing them. We should be allowing them to discover sciences such as ecology and evolutionary biology, such as chemistry, such as physics, such as geosciences. If we want informed citizens to give us functional democracies in the future, then we have to think about that 11-year-old girl and 11-year-old boy right now, who is either going to get good scientific education and start to love science or is not.
Vai, penultima. Dove sei? Dov'è? Non la vedo.
Grazie,
Là in fondo.
buongiorno.
Vai.
Okay, another question.
Buongiorno.
Good morning, good afternoon. While discussing natural selection, I jotted down one question to address to you. How can we apply the concept of natural selection also to modern society if we consider the fact that man acts and has an influence on natural selection itself by causing a loss of biodiversity, so that this is the cause of many deaths? For instance, if you were born in the emerging country, you would die more easily than if you were born in the Western world. And hence another question, as a global society, when we wish to achieve well-being for everybody, are we making a mistake because we wish something that is against the survival of the nature and all its species?
It's a really complicated and serious, important question. It goes back to Thomas Malthus, who was one of Darwin's early influences, who wrote an essay on the principle of human population and argued that generous charity for the poor was a mistake because it would only allow poor people to have more babies that would survive. And it was the beginning of a turn toward harshness in the British system of charity for the poor. And Darwin was influenced by it because he saw how it applied to animal populations, to wild populations. And some people, after Darwin published, went back to that and invented a supposed school of thought called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was never Darwinism. It was more Malthus than Darwinism because it essentially argued that it's good to have little sympathy for the poor and little support for the poor, important things like health care, because if their children die, then the human population becomes stronger. It was a terrible, sinister misunderstanding of Darwin. Now, what we face today is, I think in some ways it's a return of social Darwinism to the minds of the leaders in the United States, with the idea that government should exist for a small number of people to make a lot of money, rather than government should exist in order to help improve the lives of everybody. So, thank you.
Tra l'altro se ricordi questa domanda...
If you remember this question, David, this question asked by this student was asked to Darwin himself, who in The Origin of Man gave a wonderful answer. He said, yes, in fact, he mentions hygiene, welfare, and medicine are human activities that reduce the power of natural selection. Then he stops and says, but there are also the most noble faculties, natural selection produced in human beings. So we cannot do without them, and we keep them as such. So a very clear-cut answer. The lady here, very quickly. Yes, may I? It's difficult to... Thank you. Thank you for this chance to talk to a person like you. I am a teacher, and I will go with your words to my classrooms, but I have a question for you. What can I do? What can we do in practice to help safeguard biodiversity? What can we do to try and avoid these problems somehow?
Well, if you're a teacher, you're already doing it, and you have a great opportunity to do more of it, and that is to carry the message to your students of how important, how beautiful, how wondrous biological diversity is, and how threatened it is by human activities. As I said just before, it's important for that 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old girl or boy to understand something about the wonders of evolution and how they have produced biological diversity, but that biological diversity is vulnerable. It can be killed, it can be destroyed, it can be drastically reduced by human activities such as wasting resources, driving too many miles, letting your car run when you're not driving anywhere because it's convenient for you, wasting food, all the decisions that we make in life, how many children we have, if we have children at all, what we eat, how much meat we eat, how much we fly around the world in airplanes. I'm guilty of that. I don't have any children, and I eat some meat, not as much as I used to, but I fly around the world a lot, and that has an impact. The most important thing we can do, the most important thing you can do, and all of us can do, is to remember the things that we do have impact on those three problems that I mentioned, and to help young children understand that all of the decisions that they make will have an impact on whether polar bears exist on this planet, whether gorillas continue to exist on this planet, whether bird-winged butterflies continue to exist on this planet. And that's going to bring me to the final comment I wanted to make, and that is for all of us to remember what we have lost in the last 3 days. Jane Goodall died 3 days ago. I heard about it late at night. Yeah. Jane Goodall was a great human and a great scientist who had huge impact in the way people understand, in particular, our closest living relatives on this planet, chimpanzees and bonobos. She was the person who made the world understand that these creatures are so similar to us that we dare not treat them as anything other than brothers and sisters. We dare not use them for medical experimentation. We dare not destroy their habitat. They are our brothers and sisters. And then Jane, over time, expanded her message to help persuade everybody, but particularly children, to appreciate biological diversity, the natural world, not just the lives and the survival of other creatures, but the emotions, the emotional dimension of other creatures, chimpanzees, horses, dogs, other creatures. I was lucky enough to know Jane, to be a friend. I was not one of her close friends, but she was a friend. I spent some very interesting time on National Geographic expeditions with her in the Congo and elsewhere. And when she died 3 days ago, I knew that one of the important lights had gone out. And yet, she left us her message. She left us her books. She left us her teachings. So I encourage us all to think about that and embrace the message and the teachings of Jane Goodall. Okay. Thank you.
Grazie a David Quammen.
Thank you, David Quammen. Thanks to you and from all of us. Thank you, Telmo. Thank you so much.